this isn't the story of a magical man. It's the story of someone who stayed when walking away would have been easier. Walt Disney's struggle, rejection, ruin, imagination, and obsession, where breaking is not an option. There are places in America that exist only to teach a child the meaning of want. Marceline, Missouri, was one of them. A small farming town, flat and unforgiving, where the horizon stretched endlessly in every direction and offered nothing back. It was here, in 1901, that Walter Elias Disney was born into a family that had very little and expected even less to change. Elias Disney, Walt's father, was a hard man, not cruel in any dramatic sense, but hard in the way that poverty and disappointment make a man. He had tried farming. He had tried construction. He moved his family from city to city chasing work that never quite materialized into stability. By the time Walt was 4 years old, the family had settled on a farm in Marceline, and for a brief window of time, it was the closest thing to peace that Walt would ever know as a child. But peace costs money. The farm demanded everything and gave back barely enough. Walt and his older brothers were put to work almost as soon as they could walk. Before sunrise, before school, before anything resembling childhood began, there were chores. Animals to feed, ground to tend, a farm that had no patience for a boy who wanted to stare at the sky and imagine things. His father believed in labor as a moral virtue. Rest was suspicious. Play was wasteful. Walt learned early that imagination had no place at the breakfast table. You ate what was put in front of you, and you worked until your hands hurt, and you didn't complain about it. He was 7 years old when he first tried to sell something. He drew pictures on the side of a neighbor's house, crude images of animals and shapes, and asked to be paid for them. The neighbor, Doc Sherwood, was amused. He actually gave Walt a few coins. It was the first transaction of Walt Disney's creative life, and it planted something in him that his father's discipline could never fully uproot. The idea that imagination could be exchanged for something real. By the time Walt was 9, his father's health collapsed. The farm became impossible to maintain. Elias sold what he could, packed what remained, and moved the family again, this time to Kansas City. The idyllic stretch in Marceline was over. The animals Walt had loved, the open fields where he had first felt free, the neighbor who had paid him for his drawings, all of it left behind. He would spend the rest of his life trying to get back to Marceline. Not the place, exactly, but what it had felt like, the safety of it, the color of it, the sense that the world could be shaped into something worth looking at. He carried it with him everywhere. Into every studio, every financial disaster, every near collapse. The boy from Marceline never disappeared. He just got buried under debt, under pressure, under the weight of everything that came next. Kansas City was not kind to dreamers. It was a working city, practical and indifferent. And the Disney family arrived there with no savings and a father whose capacity for optimism had been thoroughly exhausted by the farm. Elias bought into a newspaper delivery route and immediately conscripted his sons into running it. Walt was 9 years old when he became a paper boy, not in the casual sense, not a few hours on weekend mornings. He rose at 3:30 in the morning, every morning, in temperatures that sometimes dropped below zero, and delivered papers through the dark streets of Kansas City before school started. He did this without pay. His father considered it family contribution. Walt considered it something he had no choice about. Years later, he would describe recurring nightmares about that paper route, dreams where he missed houses, where bundles of undelivered papers piled up around him while his father watched. The anxiety of those mornings never fully left him. The pressure of having to perform, of having to deliver, always deliver, became part of his psychological makeup long before he ever stepped inside a studio. But in the margins of that exhausting childhood, Walt drew. He drew everywhere and on everything. Scraps of paper, the backs of envelopes, the margins of school notebooks. He wasn't particularly disciplined about it. He was just compelled. Drawing was the one thing in his life that asked nothing of him. It didn't demand 3:30 mornings. It didn't ask him to be useful. It just let him be. He took a few art classes when he could afford them and showed something that went beyond technique, an intuition for movement, for expression, for the way a face could say something that words couldn't reach. His teachers recognized it, but recognition from a teacher doesn't change what happens at home. At home, Elias Disney still didn't see the point. Art was not a livelihood. Drawing was not a skill that put food on the table. The tension between father and son, between the man who had been beaten into pragmatism by a cruel world and the boy who still insisted on making pictures, simmered for years without ever fully breaking into the open. Walt escaped into movies when he could scrape together the price of a ticket. The films of Charlie Chaplin, the early slapstick comedies, the newsreels that flickered across white screens in dark theaters. These were windows into something larger, something that moved, something that could make a whole room full of strangers feel the same thing at the same time. He was 15 when he started to understand what he wanted. Not just to draw, to make things move, to make pictures that could walk and breathe and make people feel. The idea was enormous and ridiculous, and he had absolutely no money and absolutely no path toward it. But it was there, fully formed, like something he had always known and was only now finding words for. The first time Walt Disney tried to enter the world as something other than a delivery boy or a farmer's son, the world told him no. In 1917, the family moved again, this time to Chicago, where Elias had invested in a jelly manufacturing company. Walt was 16. He enrolled at McKinley High School and began taking night classes at the Chicago Academy of Fine Arts, squeezing whatever creative education he could into the hours his father didn't own. He worked on the school newspaper. He drew cartoons. He was, for the first time, starting to feel like the pieces of something were assembling themselves around him. Then America entered the First World War. Walt wanted to enlist. This is important to understand, not because enlisting was the noble or obvious thing to do, but because of what it reveals about who he was at 16. He wanted to be part of something. He wanted to matter. He wanted an identity that went beyond his father's jelly factory and his 3:30 a.m. paper route, and the shapeless anxiety that had followed him since childhood. The army represented a door out of everything that had so far defined him. They turned him away. At 16, he was too young. He lied about his age to join the Red Cross Ambulance Corps and was accepted. By the time he shipped out to France in November 1918, the war was essentially over. He arrived to a landscape of aftermath, mud and rubble, and the particular silence that follows catastrophe, and spent his months there driving an ambulance, hauling supplies, and watching the world try to piece itself back together after the most destructive conflict in human history. He wasn't in combat. He wasn't heroic in any conventional sense, but he was there, and it affected him. The scale of waste, the randomness of survival, the profound indifference of the world to individual human ambition. All of it registered somewhere beneath the surface of who he was becoming. He decorated his ambulance with cartoons, while other drivers kept their vehicles plain. Walt covered his with drawings, Chaplin characters, animals, jokes he'd invented. His commanding officers apparently found this amusing rather than insubordinate. But what it really shows is the compulsion at work. Even in France, even surrounded by the wreckage of a world war, Walt Disney was making pictures. He returned to America in 1919 with no savings, no formal education beyond a few art classes, no professional connections, and no clear plan. He was 18 years old. His father expected him to come back and resume something practical. The jelly factory, perhaps. A real job. Walt had other ideas. He told his family he was going to Kansas City to become a commercial artist. His father thought this was foolish. His mother worried quietly. His older brother Roy, who would become the financial spine of everything Walt ever built, offered what support he could, which at that point was mostly emotional. Walt arrived in Kansas City with $40. The commercial art studio he applied to turned him down. Too inexperienced, not qualified enough. He found temporary work at the Pesman Rubin Commercial Art Studio and was let go after the Christmas rush ended. Then he tried for a job as a cartoonist at the Kansas City Star, the very newspaper whose route he had spent years delivering in the dark. They rejected him. He was 19 years old, living in a city where he had delivered papers since before dawn as a child. And the newspaper that had owned so many of his worst mornings didn't want him now either. The insecurity this produced was profound and lasting. Walt Disney would spend the rest of his life, through every success, every critical triumph, every moment that the outside world interpreted as evidence of his genius, carrying the weight of that early rejection. It never fully left him. Not when Mickey Mouse made him famous. Not when Snow White made him rich. Not even when Disneyland made him a cultural institution. The boy who got turned away by the Kansas City Star became the man who could never fully believe that the next thing wouldn't be turned away too. The anxiety of that time became the engine of everything that followed. This is where the pattern begins. The pattern that would define Walt Disney's life. Believe in something, build something, lose everything, start again. After the Star rejection, Walt found his footing in an unexpected place. He connected with a man named Ub Iwerks, a gifted draftsman, technically precise, where Walt was expressively chaotic. And together, they scraped together enough small commercial work to stay alive. They made advertising films for local theaters, short animated pieces that played before the features. It was rough, low-budget work, but it was animation, and animation, Walt had decided, was the future. He was 20 years old, and he had seen enough of the world's early animated films to believe that no one was doing it right yet. The medium was too stiff, too mechanical, too disconnected from the physical world that it was trying to replicate. Walt believed that animated characters could feel real, that they could carry emotion, that an audience could love a drawing the way they loved an actor, not in spite of its artificiality, but because of what it revealed beneath the surface. This was not a common view in 1921. On the strength of this vision, and very little else, Walt convinced a group of Kansas City investors to fund a studio. He called it Laugh-O-Gram Studios. He was 20 years old. He had no business training, no formal film education, no distribution deals, and no safety net of any kind. What he had was an idea, and an absolute refusal to consider the possibility that it wouldn't work. Laugh-O-Gram produced a series of animated fairy tales, modernized retellings of classic stories, aimed at children, technically ambitious for their time and place. The animators Walt hired were young, mostly untrained, working for almost nothing because they believed in what they were doing, or because they needed any work at all. The studio hummed with the specific energy of people who haven't yet learned to be afraid. The films were good, not great by later standards, but genuinely inventive, full of the visual wit and physical comedy that Walt had absorbed from years of watching Chaplin. The problem wasn't the product. The problem was the business. Their distributor, a company called Pictorial Clubs, Inc., had contracted to pay $4,000 for a series of films. They paid $1,500 up front, and then, quietly, catastrophically, went bankrupt before paying the rest. Laugh-O-Gram had built its entire financial model on that money arriving. When it didn't, everything began to collapse in slow motion. Walt couldn't make payroll. The animators who had signed on for the adventure started to disappear, one by one, as the reality of not being paid for work they had done set in. Bills went unpaid. Vendors stopped delivering supplies. The phones rang with creditors, and Walt learned the particular skill, one he would need many times in the decades ahead, of sounding confident when you were in free fall. He tried everything. He shot a short documentary film about Kansas City's sewer system to raise cash. He took on whatever work came through the door. He convinced a local dentist to fund a short educational film about dental hygiene. None of it was enough. The studio was sinking, and Walt knew it and kept working anyway, which was either brave or delusional. And in the moment, it's very hard to tell the difference. In the final weeks before the collapse, Walt was so broke that he couldn't afford food. He had been reduced to eating scraps wherever he could find them. He hadn't paid rent. He was 21 years old, running a company that was dying, trying to hold together a crew that had every reason to leave and no reason to stay, sustained entirely by the conviction that if he could just get the next film finished, if he could just find the next investor, if he could just hold on a little longer, it wasn't enough. In 1923, Laugh-O-Gram Studios declared bankruptcy. Walt Disney's first company was dead. He had nothing. Less than nothing. He had debts. He had a body of work that no one had properly paid for. He had a group of animators who had believed in him and had been let down. He had a Kansas City that had twice now told him he wasn't quite enough. What he had decided, somewhere in the rubble of Laugh-O-Gram, was that Kansas City was finished with him, and he was finished with Kansas City. He scraped together $40, the same amount he'd arrived in the city with years earlier, and bought a train ticket. He was going to Hollywood. He was 21 years old. He had already gone bankrupt once, and he genuinely believed that the next thing he tried would be different. This is either the most American story ever told or the most troubling one. Possibly both. Los Angeles in 1923 was not yet the mythological city it would become. It was ambitious and sprawling, and full of people who had come from somewhere else with very little and an enormous conviction that this was the place where things would finally change. Walt Disney fit in perfectly. He had no money, no connections, no clear plan, and absolute certainty that he was going to make something that mattered. He showed up at his Uncle Robert's house and was given a place to sleep on a small cot. He spent his days going from studio to studio, trying to get any kind of work in the film industry. The studios weren't interested. They were building their own systems, their own talent pipelines, their own hierarchies, and a 21-year-old from Kansas City with a bankruptcy on his record and a portfolio of unfinished animated shorts was not what anyone was looking for. He applied to every major studio in Hollywood. He was turned down by everyone. The rejections were not dramatic. They didn't tell him he was without talent or that animation was a dead end. They were worse than that. They were indifferent. They looked at his portfolio and handed it back with the specific courtesy. That means we don't see the point of this, and we don't have time to explain why. Walt wrote to his brother Roy, who was recuperating from tuberculosis in a veterans hospital in the area. Roy had always been the steady one, cautious, financially minded, the ballast to Walt's instability. When Walt told him his plan to start a new studio, Roy did something that would shape both of their lives for the next several decades. He agreed to help. Roy Disney checked himself out of the hospital to go into business with his brother. Think about what that means. Roy was sick. He was in a place that was treating him. He left it to partner with a 21-year-old who had already gone bankrupt once and had nothing but ideas and intensity to offer. Roy Disney is one of the most underrated figures in American business history, and the choice he made in that hospital was the first of many times he would bet his own stability on Walt's imagination. Together, the brothers pooled what little they had. Walt had saved a few $100s from odd jobs. Roy contributed his savings. Their Uncle Robert provided some additional funding. With this, a few $100s total, they established the Disney Brothers Cartoon Studio in the back of a real estate office on Kingswell Avenue. The space was tiny. The equipment was second-hand. The budget was non-existent. Walt wrote to a New York distributor named Margaret Winkler and proposed a series of films he called the Alice Comedies, a concept he had originally developed at Laugh-O-Gram, combining live-action footage of a little girl with animated characters. Winkler, somewhat remarkably, agreed to distribute them. The first Alice film was completed in 1923. It wasn't technically sophisticated. It wasn't beautifully drawn, but it had something, an energy, a visual inventiveness, a sense of humor that operated on multiple levels, that separated it from the generic animated content being produced at the time. They sold it. They sold the series. And for a brief period, the Disney Brothers studio was actually paying its bills. But the stress of those early years was enormous and corrosive in ways that didn't always show immediately. Walt slept in the office regularly, not because he chose to, but because there wasn't money for both rent and production supplies, and he always chose production. He ate cheap food when he ate at all. He worked 18-hour days because there was always something that needed to be done, and he had no staff large enough to do it without him. He was also developing something else during this period: an absolute refusal to accept quality as a negotiable standard. While other animation studios produced content quickly and cheaply, treating their product as disposable entertainment to be cranked out and forgotten, Walt kept pushing for better: more fluid movement, more expressive characters, more of whatever he saw in his head that wasn't yet making it onto the screen. This obsession with quality was not financially rational. It cost more than the budget allowed and took longer than the schedule permitted. Roy spent considerable energy trying to get Walt to accept what was achievable, rather than continuing to reach for what was perfect. Walt never fully accepted this. The gap between what he imagined and what he could currently produce was the source of his greatest achievements and his most destructive failures. It drove him forward, and it nearly destroyed him over and over for the next 4 decades. In 1925, Walt married Lillian Bounds, one of the studio's ink and paint artists. It was the steadiest relationship of his adult life, not because it was easy, but because Lillian was one of the very few people who understood the specific shape of his obsession and chose to stay anyway. She would spend the next 40 years watching her husband pour every dollar and every hour into ideas that terrified sensible people and built the world as we now know it. But the relative stability of 1925 was about to be shattered. The next catastrophe was already forming, and this one would be worse than Laugh-O-Gram. This one would take something that wasn't just money. There is a specific kind of destruction that comes not from failure, but from success. When something you've built starts to work, when the world starts to see what you saw, that's when the people with more power and more money show up to take it from you. Walt Disney learned this lesson in the cruelest possible way. By 1927, the Alice comedies had run their course. Margaret Winkler had married a man named Charles Mintz, who had taken over the distribution business, and Mintz was pushing for something new. Walt developed a new character, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Oswald was energetic, mischievous, physically expressive. A character that moved with the kind of rubbery, elastic energy that made audiences lean forward. Walt and his team produced a series of Oswald films that were genuinely popular. Universal Pictures, which held the rights through Mintz, was pleased. Walt traveled to New York in early 1928 to negotiate a new contract. He brought with him the reasonable expectation that Universal would recognize the value of what he had created and compensate him accordingly. He was the one who had developed Oswald. He was the one who had built the character from nothing. He was the one whose creative vision had made the series work. What Charles Mintz told him in that meeting was one of the most devastating things Walt Disney ever heard. First, Universal owned Oswald, not Walt. The character Walt had created, had named, had drawn, had brought to life. It legally belonged to the distributor. Second, Mintz intended to reduce Walt's production budget by 20%. Third, if Walt didn't accept these terms, Universal would simply take the character and give it to another studio to produce. Fourth, and this was the blade that went deepest, Mintz revealed that he had already quietly approached most of Walt's animators and signed them to personal contracts. If Walt walked away, he wouldn't just lose Oswald, he would lose most of his team. Walt sat in that meeting and absorbed the full weight of what had just happened. His animators, people he had hired, trained, worked alongside in cramped rooms for years, had been secretly negotiating with his distributor while continuing to cash his paychecks. The character he had built was owned by someone else. The studio he was trying to grow was being dismantled around him by someone with more leverage and less loyalty. He was 26 years old. He did not accept the terms. This is worth pausing on. The rational choice, the pragmatic choice, the choice that any business advisor of the era would have recommended, was to take the reduced deal. Something was better than nothing. Oswald was gone regardless. Accept the reality and move forward. Walt refused. He walked away from Oswald entirely. In the immediate aftermath, this looked like a catastrophic mistake. He had no character, no contract, no distributor, and significantly fewer animators. Ub Iwerks, his most gifted artist and oldest collaborator, had remained loyal and stayed. A decision that would soon matter enormously. But the studio was at a genuine crossroads. Without Oswald, without the income from those films, without a distribution deal, they were back to the beginning. Walt took the train back to California. The story, which Walt himself told many times, and which has entered American mythology, is that he drew a new character on that train. A mouse. Simple, round forms, designed so that any moderately skilled animator could replicate the shape consistently across hundreds of drawings. Walt called him Mortimer. Lillian, when he told her about it, suggested Mickey instead. Mickey Mouse was born in the window seat of a train traveling west, created by a man who had just been systematically robbed of everything he had built. Whether the story is entirely literal or somewhat compressed by time and retelling barely matters. What matters is the truth at its center. The loss of Oswald didn't break Walt Disney. It focused him. It stripped away any remaining illusion about who owned what and who could be trusted, and what the only real protection was. The only real protection was ownership. control, making sure that what he created could never again be legally taken from him by someone with a better lawyer. He would spend the rest of his life fighting for that principle, sometimes well, sometimes badly, sometimes in ways that made him look paranoid or controlling or difficult. But the lesson of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit was a lesson he never forgot. Someone will always try to take what you've built. The only answer is to build it in a way that can't be taken. The loss of Oswald did something to Walt Disney's psychology that went beyond business strategy. It introduced a permanent current of suspicion that would run through every relationship he had for the rest of his life. It wasn't paranoia exactly. It was pattern recognition. He had trusted people and been betrayed. He had built something and had it taken. He resolved, somewhere in the wreckage of that New York meeting, that he would never be in that position again. The problem with that resolution is that protecting yourself from betrayal often requires you to stop fully trusting anyone. And Walt Disney, for all his creative genius, was never very good at separating reasonable caution from reflexive control. This chapter is about the people who left, the talented, skilled, indispensable people who helped Walt build his studio and then walked away. Some because they were underpaid, some because they felt disrespected, some because the grinding pressure of working for a perfectionist with an unreliable relationship to other people's needs wore them down to nothing. Ub Iwerks had been Walt's collaborator since Kansas City. He was, by many accounts, the most technically gifted animator of his generation. Possibly the most gifted animator who had ever worked in the medium up to that point, when Walt had almost no staff after the Oswald disaster. Iwerks was the one who essentially single-handedly animated the first Mickey Mouse cartoons. He drew hundreds of drawings a day at a pace that was physically almost incomprehensible. Mickey Mouse would not exist, or would not exist as the fluid, expressive character the world came to love, without Ub Iwerks. In 1930, Iwerks left. He was recruited by a competitor who offered him his own studio, his own billing, his own chance to be the name on the door instead of the invisible engine behind someone else's name. Walt was devastated in the specific way that a betrayal by someone you love always devastates, the personal injury compounding the professional one. He and Iwerks had started together, had survived Laugh-O-Gram together, had built Mickey together. And now Iwerks was gone. The Iwerks departure was the most personally painful, but it wasn't the only one. Throughout the 1930s, as the studio grew and the demands increased and Walt's standards continued to rise faster than anyone's capacity to meet them, talented people left in a steady stream. Some went to competitors. Some left animation entirely. Some just couldn't sustain the pace of working for someone who was never quite satisfied, who always saw the gap between what had been produced and what could theoretically be produced, and who communicated that gap in ways that could be exhausting and demoralizing. Walt was not always kind. This is part of the record. He could be generous and enthusiastic and magnetic when the work was going well, and he was excited about a project. But he could also be dismissive, cold, and cutting when the work fell short of his vision. And his vision was always higher than the work by design. He had a temper that came from frustration rather than cruelty. But the distinction mattered less to the people on the receiving end. He could ridicule a piece of work in front of a room full of people, and then seem genuinely puzzled by why the person who produced it seemed withdrawn and careful around him afterward. The studio he was building was, in many ways, a direct extension of his own psychology. Brilliant, innovative, commercially successful, emotionally costly, and shot through with the permanent anxiety of someone who had lost things before and was always braced to lose them again. What the departures taught him, or should have taught him, though he didn't always learn the right lesson, was that talent is its own form of leverage. The people who could do what they could do had options. The animators, writers, and artists who made Disney films were not interchangeable. They were craftspeople with real skills in a specialized field, and if you treated them like they were replaceable, eventually they proved that you were wrong by leaving. He understood this intellectually. He had built enough to know that the studio was only as good as the people in it, but the emotional reality of a man who trusted barely anyone and controlled everything was that he kept recreating the conditions that made talented people feel undervalued and overlooked. The losses accumulated. They would keep accumulating, and the most devastating loss of that kind, the one that would come years later, when it would be not one person, but hundreds of people who walked out at once, was already being quietly assembled by the unresolved tensions in the studio's culture. But that comes later. For now, there was Mickey, and Mickey was changing everything. Mickey Mouse did not save Walt Disney. Not immediately, not cleanly, not in the way the story is often told. What Mickey did was give Walt a second chance. And Walt, being Walt, came very close to squandering it through the sheer ambition of his own vision. The first two Mickey Mouse cartoons, Plain Crazy and Gallopin' Gaucho, were produced as silent films in 1928. They were charming, energetic, technically competent. They did not sell. Distributors who saw them were politely uninterested. Mickey Mouse, in his silent incarnation, was just another cartoon character in a field crowded with cartoon characters. And there was nothing in those first two films to suggest that this particular mouse was going to matter. Then Walt saw the jazz singer. Al Jolson had made a sound film in 1927, and the industry was still processing what this meant. Sound was coming, clearly, but the major studios were slow to commit. because the transition was expensive and technically complicated, and they had enormous investments in existing infrastructure that silent films didn't. Threaten. Walt moved instantly. He understood, with the same intuitive clarity that had made him believe in animation before anyone else did, that synchronized sound was not a novelty. It was the future, and the future was available right now to anyone willing to take the risk of pursuing it before it was safe. He went back to Ub Iwerks, who hadn't left yet, and told him they were going to produce a third Mickey Mouse cartoon, this one with synchronized sound. The cartoon would be called Steamboat Willie. The process of synchronizing animation to a recorded soundtrack had not been standardized. There was no established method. Walt had to figure it out, largely from scratch, while also producing the film and managing a studio with almost no financial cushion. They completed Steamboat Willie in 1928. The recording session in New York was chaotic and expensive, and went significantly over budget. Walt conducted the musicians himself, using a metronome to keep the tempo locked to the animation, sweating through the takes, burning through cash he didn't have with the complete certainty that this was going to work. It premiered at the Colony Theater in New York on November 18, 1928. The audience, who had been watching silent films with musical accompaniment their entire lives, who had never heard a cartoon character produce synchronized sound, heard Mickey Mouse whistle for the first time. They heard the percussion of the objects he was playing on a riverboat. They heard the sound of an animated world that seemed to be alive in a completely new way. They lost their minds. The reviews described the theater's reaction as something between delight and amazement. People laughed. They applauded during the film. Some came back to see it multiple times. The distributor, who had passed on the first 2 silent Mickey films, immediately came back asking for more. Mickey Mouse was not a character anymore. He was a phenomenon, and Walt Disney was now a name that meant something. But here's what the legend tends to skip over. The years immediately following Steamboat Willie were financially brutal. The sound cartoons cost dramatically more to produce than silent ones had. The equipment was expensive, the recording process was expensive, and the demand for new content was relentless. Walt kept reinvesting every dollar the studio made into the next thing, the better thing, the more ambitious thing, rather than banking a cushion that might have protected him when the next crisis came. Because the next crisis always came. The personality of the studio during these years was a reflection of Walt's own psychology. Brilliant, relentless, chronically underfunded, always reaching for the next level of quality, even when the current level was already impressive enough to succeed on its commercial terms. He was building something that no one had built before. He was also building the specific architecture of a business that could not survive a single bad year. Walt Disney had a problem that most businessmen would have called a gift, and that most sane accountants would have called a crisis. Every time the studio achieved financial stability, he immediately spent that stability on something more expensive. Steamboat Willie had established Mickey Mouse as a cultural force. The Mickey Mouse merchandise licensing program, which Walt and Roy set up in the early 1930s, generated revenue streams that the film business alone couldn't match. Mickey Mouse watches, toys, school supplies, clothing. The character's image was everywhere. And for the first time in his career, Walt had real money coming through the door. He used it to fund the Silly Symphonies. The Silly Symphonies were a separate series of animated shorts, not Mickey Mouse cartoons, but standalone pieces that used music as their structural foundation. They were technically more ambitious, narratively more varied, and financially significantly riskier than the Mickey films. They were also, in the view of many people inside the studio, beside the point. The Mickey Mouse cartoons were the product. The Silly Symphonies were a luxury. Walt saw it differently. He saw the symphonies as a laboratory, a place to develop techniques, to push animators, to solve problems that the Mickey films couldn't accommodate because Mickey had to be Mickey every time. In 1932, he used the Silly Symphony series to debut a new technology, 3-strip Technicolor. The deal Walt struck with Technicolor gave him a 2-year exclusive on the process for animation. For 2 years, no other animation studio could produce films in the full-color Technicolor format that Walt was using. Flowers and Trees, the 1932 Silly Symphony that debuted the color process, won the first Academy Award ever given to an animated film. Walt had won again by taking a risk that frightened his own brother and business partner. He had gotten ahead of the curve before anyone else could follow. But the financial reality behind these triumphs was always more precarious than the cultural story suggested. The studio was growing rapidly, which meant payroll was growing, which meant overhead was growing, which meant the margin for error was shrinking, even as the public profile of Walt Disney was expanding. Roy Disney spent considerable portions of the 1930s in a state of quiet financial terror, while Walt pursued the next innovation, the next technological leap, the next boundary that needed pushing. Roy was backfilling the holes, negotiating with banks, managing creditors, finding ways to bridge the gap between what the studio was spending and what it was earning. The brothers had a relationship that was, in many ways, the most functional partnership in the history of American entertainment. Roy understood Walt. He didn't always agree with him, and he said so directly and without drama when he didn't. But he understood him. He knew that Walt's risk appetite was not recklessness, but genuine vision. He knew that the investments that seemed insane from a financial perspective often paid off in ways that rational analysis couldn't have predicted. He also knew that one day, the investment that seemed insane might just be insane. And by the mid-1930s, Walt was working toward an idea so enormous, so expensive, and so far outside anything that had been attempted in animation that even Roy, loyal, committed, deeply invested Roy, was struggling to believe in it. A feature-length animated film, not a series of shorts, not a 10-minute program, a full theatrical feature, 80 minutes of animation, built around a complete narrative, designed to ask an audience to sit in a theater and care about drawn characters for the length of a real movie. Hollywood called it Disney's folly. They meant it literally. They thought he was going to destroy the studio with this idea. The conventional wisdom was absolute. Audiences couldn't maintain emotional engagement with animated characters for that long. Animation was a novelty, a short-form medium, a palate cleanser between the real films. Walt didn't argue with them. He just started production on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and almost immediately, everything started to go wrong. The production of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is, in some respects, the central act of Walt Disney's entire career. Everything before it was preparation. Everything after it was consequence. And the making of it was an experience so financially catastrophic, so physically exhausting, so psychologically demanding, that it left permanent marks on everyone involved. Walt announced the project in 1934. He had no script, no budget, no distributor commitment, and no technology capable of producing what he had in mind. What he had was the story, a German fairy tale he had seen as a stage production as a child in Kansas City, and a conviction that it could be something that no one had ever seen before. The budget estimates, when Roy and the studio's financial people first worked them out, were troubling. A feature-length animated film would require tens of thousands of individual drawings, hundreds of thousands, ultimately executed to a quality standard that far exceeded anything the studio had previously produced. It would require years of work. It would require a staff significantly larger than the studio currently employed. The initial estimate was approximately $150,000. This was, by any measure, an enormous sum in 1934. Bank of America, which provided the studio's primary financing, viewed the project with deep skepticism. The studio's distributor, RKO, had contractual commitments to the shorts, but no obligation to distribute a feature. Walt was proposing to spend money he didn't have on a project that the industry consensus said wouldn't work. He went ahead. The production consumed the studio in a way that no previous project had. Walt involved himself in every aspect, every character design, every scene layout, every bit of animation that crossed his desk. He held story meetings that lasted for hours, acting out the characters himself, demonstrating the emotion he wanted in his body before he could describe it in words. He fired work that wasn't good enough and demanded that it be redone, regardless of the cost in time or money. The budget exploded almost immediately. $150,000 became $250,000, then $500,000, then more. Each time Roy brought the numbers to Walt, Walt acknowledged them without modifying his approach. The work had to be what it had to be. The cost was the cost. By the time production was deep into its final phase, the budget had surpassed $1.4 million. The studio had mortgaged itself to finish the film. Walt had personally guaranteed loans. The Bank of America representative, who came to review the studio's finances that year, a man named Joseph Rosenberg, was shown a rough cut of the film in progress. The story goes that when he saw it, he told Walt it would make a lot of money. It was the only thing standing between the Disney studio and complete financial ruin. The production also took a physical toll that Walt never fully recovered from. He was working constantly, 18-hour days, 7 days a week, sustained by cigarettes and coffee, and the sheer momentum of something that had to be finished. He was thin, exhausted, visibly worn. Lillian watched her husband disappear into the film and worried in the specific way that spouses of obsessives worry, not about a single crisis, but about the slow motion toll of a pattern with no clear endpoint. There were moments during production when Walt would screen the work in progress and see the gap between what had been produced and what he had imagined, and the weight of that gap would crush something in him temporarily. He knew the film could be brilliant. He knew it wasn't there yet. He knew the studio was running out of money and time. He knew the industry was watching and waiting for him to fail. The pressure was relentless. The animation of Snow White herself was a particular technical problem. Human characters were far more difficult to animate convincingly than animals or simplified cartoon figures. The closer you got to realistic human anatomy and movement, the more obvious the errors became. Walt brought in a live-action actress to be filmed as a reference point for the animators, a technique called rotoscoping that helped them understand how a real human body moved. Still, getting Snow White right took months of iteration and frustration. Walt wasn't satisfied with her for a long time. She looked too stiff, too artificial, not emotional enough. He kept sending the work back. The dwarfs were easier. They were comic figures, more stylized, more forgiving of the slight exaggerations that animation naturally produces. But they still required months of development work before Walt found the specific personalities he was looking for. Grumpy's surface hostility concealing genuine feeling, Doc's well-meaning fussiness, Dopey's wordless, childlike sweetness. The villain, the evil queen, required Walt to make a decision that was, for a children's film, genuinely audacious. He made her terrifying, not silly, not cartoon evil, but genuinely menacing in a way that could reach through the screen and make a child feel real fear. Some of his colleagues argued against this. Children's entertainment, they suggested, should be safe, comforting. The darkness in the fairy tale should be softened. Walt refused. He understood, with the instincts of someone who had grown up reading the actual grim stories before they were sanitized, that the fear was the point, that you couldn't have the emotional catharsis of the ending without first having the genuine dread of the threat. That emotion required stakes, and stakes required the possibility of real loss. He was right. He was almost always right about these things: the financial irresponsibility, and the creative stubbornness, and the relentless cost overruns, all pointed toward the same fundamental truth. Walt Disney's instincts about what made a story work were essentially flawless. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs premiered at the Carthay Circle Theater in Hollywood on December 21, 1937. The audience, which included many of the industry figures who had predicted the film's failure, sat in the darkened theater and watched something they had been told was impossible. They watched a drawn character feel. They watched an audience of adults, sophisticated industry professionals who had seen everything, cry at the death of an animated girl. When the lights came up, many of them were too moved to speak. The film grossed $8 million in its initial release, an astronomical sum in 1937, enough to clear the studio's debts, enough to fund the construction of a new studio in Burbank, enough to prove that Disney's folly had been the most prescient project in the history of American cinema. Walt Disney was 36 years old, and he had just made the most successful animated film ever produced. He was also, in ways that weren't yet visible from the outside, beginning to crack. Snow White's success was real, but it arrived with a shadow attached to it that Walt couldn't seem to shake. The years following the film's triumph should have been triumphant. The studio moved into its new Burbank campus, a purpose-built facility designed to Walt's specifications, organized by function, beautiful in the way that a man who had spent years working in cramped offices designs a workspace when he finally has the money to do it right. New talent was hired. New projects were commissioned. Pinocchio, Fantasia, Bambi, Dumbo. All of them in various stages of development simultaneously. All of them expensive. All of them pushing the boundaries of what animation could achieve. Walt was building an empire. From the outside, it looked like the natural flowering of genius meeting opportunity. From the inside, it was an exhausted man trying to sustain a standard he had set for himself that might simply be unsustainable. Pinocchio and Fantasia, both released in 1940, were each magnificent. They were also both expensive failures at the box office. Pinocchio cost $2.6 million to produce, more than any previous Disney film. And while it was critically praised and would eventually earn back its investment through re-release, its initial run was disappointing. The European market, which had historically provided a significant portion of Disney's foreign revenue, had been effectively closed by the Second World War. Audiences that might have seen the film in London or Paris were otherwise occupied. Fantasia was worse. Walt had conceived it as a revolutionary fusion of animation and classical music, a genuine artistic statement that elevated the medium beyond entertainment into something closer to fine art. He spent lavishly on it. He developed new audio technology for its theatrical presentation. He overrode concerns from distributors and colleagues who worried that audiences wouldn't accept animation without a traditional narrative structure. He was right that the film was extraordinary. He was wrong that it would make money. Fantasia grossed far less than its production and marketing costs, and the financial blow it dealt the studio was severe. The pattern had become: Walt makes something brilliant. Walt spends more than the studio can afford. Roy scrambles to find the money. Something unexpected goes wrong with the market. The studio finds itself in crisis again. The crisis this time was existential. By 1941, the studio had accumulated significant debt. The new Burbank facility, however beautiful, had been partially financed through stock offerings and loans that were now coming due. Walt had always survived his financial disasters through the next success. Snow White had bailaid out everything that preceded it. But there was no guaranteed Snow White waiting to bail out Fantasia. Walt's physical and psychological condition during this period was alarming to those close to him. He was suffering from what was then called a nervous breakdown. We might now describe it as severe anxiety and depression, burnout in the clinical rather than casual sense. He wasn't sleeping. He couldn't concentrate. The creative energy that had sustained him through decades of crisis had burned down to something dim and uncertain. Lillian convinced him to take a vacation. The two of them went to South America on what was ostensibly a goodwill tour arranged through the State Department, but was, in reality, an attempt to get Walt out of the studio and away from the specific anxiety of a building full of problems he couldn't immediately solve. He returned somewhat restored, but the studio he came back to was not the studio he had left. The conditions that had been building for years in the studio's culture. The inequality between Walt's star status and the relatively modest wages paid to the animators who made the films possible. The resentment of a workforce that felt overworked and undercompensated the specific grievances of a labor movement that was organizing across American industries. We're about to produce the most painful episode in Walt Disney's professional life. He was coming home to a strike, and the strike would hurt him in ways that went beyond money. The world that Walt Disney had built his career in effectively ceased to exist in December 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything for the studio in ways that were immediate and concrete. The day after the attack, the United States Army moved into the Disney studio in Burbank. Not by negotiation, not by invitation, but by government order. Soldiers arrived and took over a significant portion of the facility to use as a storage and vehicle maintenance depot. Walt had no meaningful recourse. The war had arrived at his door. The Army's presence was disruptive in the physical sense. Space that had been production space was now occupied by military equipment. But the real damage was in what the war did to the business model that Disney had depended on. The foreign markets that represented roughly a third of the studio's revenue were gone. The European box office had been inaccessible since 1939. Japan was now the enemy. The economies that Walt had been building distribution relationships with for a decade had been restructured by the logic of global conflict into something unrecognizable. The government offered contracts to partially compensate. The Disney studio produced training films, instructional materials, and propaganda pieces for the military for essentially the entire duration of the war. Some of these were creative in their own right. The studio produced pieces that explained complex technical processes, medical information, and military tactics in visual formats that were more effective than text. But they were not the films Walt wanted to make. They were not the projects that had drawn him into animation in the first place. He was a man who had devoted his professional life to entertainment, to the project of making audiences feel things, to the deliberate creation of joy and wonder. Now, running a factory that produced instructional films about airplane maintenance and nutrition deficiencies, the staff had been depleted by the strike of 1941, which had ended in a negotiated settlement that left lasting bitterness on all sides. Many of the most talented animators were gone. The ones who remained were producing government work that paid modestly and offered none of the creative challenge that had originally attracted them to the studio. The features that came out during the war years, Saludos Amigos, The Three Caballeros, Make Mine Music, were package films, collections of loosely connected short segments rather than unified narratives. They were inexpensive to produce, and they needed to be. The studio was surviving, not thriving. These films were the product of constraint rather than vision, and Walt knew it and hated it. He had wanted to make Bambi with the scale and emotional ambition of Snow White. Bambi had been in development since before the war, and he had pushed for it to be produced with the same uncompromising standard. It was released in 1942 to critical praise, but mixed box office. The market had changed. Audiences were distracted by the war, and the film's quiet, melancholy tone felt disconnected from the national mood. Walt spent the war years with a specific kind of frustration, the frustration of a man who knew what he was capable of and was being prevented from doing it by circumstances entirely outside his control. He couldn't fight the war. He couldn't restore the foreign markets. He couldn't bring back the animators who had left during the strike or been drafted into the military. He could only wait, and waiting was something Walt Disney had never been good at. The studio survived the war years, but the Disney of 1945 was a diminished version of the Disney of 1937. Leaner in staff, constrained in ambition, still carrying the debts that Pinocchio and Fantasia had generated, missing the talent that had made the pre-war films possible. The world had been transformed by the war. Walt had not been transformed so much as temporarily suppressed. When the fighting ended and the markets reopened, and the possibility of making real films returned, he came back with the same hunger he had always had. But the studio culture he returned to had been damaged in ways that would take years to fully repair. The strike had left wounds that didn't close cleanly, and the man who had once inspired near-religious devotion from his staff was now a more complicated figure, still admired, still feared, but also resented in ways that he had never quite been before. May 29, 1941, the day Walt Disney's employees walked out of his studio, is one of the most complicated and painful episodes in American labor history. Complicated because both sides were partly right and partly wrong. Painful because the wounds it opened never fully healed. The strike had been coming for a long time. The Disney studio of the late 1930s was, in many respects, a remarkable place to work. The Burbank facility was beautiful. The cafeteria was subsidized. Walt gave studio tour and held story meetings that inspired genuine creative excitement. The quality of the work being produced was, by common consensus, unmatched anywhere in the world. But the pay was inequitable in ways that had been festering for years. The animators who produced the actual drawings, the people whose hands and eyes and creative skill were the direct source of the studio's product, were paid on a scale that varied enormously based on Walt's personal assessment of their value. Some were paid well, many were not. Assistants and in-between animators who did the grinding work of producing the thousands of drawings that connected the key frames were paid wages that barely covered living costs in Los Angeles. Meanwhile, the studio was profitable enough to be building a new campus. Mickey Mouse merchandise was generating millions of dollars a year. Snow White had made the studio a global brand. The people who had made that success possible were struggling to make rent. The Screen Cartoonists Guild, which had been organizing across the industry, found fertile ground in the Disney Studios workforce. Art Babbitt, one of the studio's senior animators, the man who had developed the Goofy character, and was, by many accounts, one of the most talented people working there, became a leader of the organizing effort. Walt took this personally, deeply, viscerally, irrevocably personally. He could not accept the idea that his employees, people he thought of genuinely as part of a creative family, people he had worked alongside in the cramped offices of his early studios, were organizing against him. He had given them jobs when the Depression was making jobs scarce. He had built them a beautiful studio. He had tried to create a place where the work itself was a reward for doing it. What he had difficulty accepting was that his conception of the studio as a creative family was not the same as actually treating the people who worked there as equals. A family in Walt Disney's understanding was structured. He was the creative authority, and the others were contributors to his vision. That was not, in the understanding of the Screen Cartoonists Guild, what family meant. Walt responded to the organizing effort in ways that were counterproductive. He made public statements that were dismissive and contemptuous. He suggested that the strike was being driven by outside agitators, by communists, specifically, a charge that was both unfair and strategically disastrous given the political climate. He treated the strike as a personal betrayal rather than a labor dispute, which made negotiation essentially impossible for a period. The strike lasted 5 months. During that time, picket lines formed outside the studio and did not disperse. The names and faces of Walt's former colleagues, people he had worked with for years, people he had hired and trained, and in some cases genuinely cared about, were on those picket lines. Some of the most talented animators in the studio had walked out. The settlement, when it finally came, was a defeat for Walt. The guild was recognized. Wages were adjusted. The conditions that had produced the strike were formalized into contractual obligations. Walt never forgave it, not the outcome, and not the people who had pushed for it. Art Babbitt was fired after the settlement, a decision that created additional legal complications, and that many saw as an act of explicit retaliation. The public image damage was significant. Walt Disney, the beloved creator of Mickey Mouse and Snow White, had been on the wrong side of a labor dispute, had been visibly, publicly, on record, calling his own employees communist agitators. It was a story that followed him, but the deeper damage was internal, the trust that had characterized the studio at its best, the collective belief that everyone in the building was working toward something worth working toward had been fractured. You can rebuild a staff after people leave. You cannot fully rebuild the specific culture that existed before the people who made it left. The Disney studio of the post-strike years was professionally accomplished. It continued to produce work of genuine quality, but something had gone out of it, some essential warmth, some sense of collective investment in the project that it would never fully recover. Walt knew it. He didn't admit it, or not in ways that were visible, but he knew it. And knowing it added to the accumulating weight of everything he carried. By the early 1950s, Walt Disney was the most famous name in American entertainment. Mickey Mouse was a cultural institution. Snow White, Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland. The studio's films were the defining visual vocabulary of American childhood. He had won more Academy Awards than anyone in history. He was respected, celebrated, and by any external measure, secure. He was also profoundly bored. The studio had settled into a rhythm that produced profitable, high-quality work, but the sense of genuine danger, the specific electricity of building something that might fail, the raw creative risk that had characterized the early years, had faded. Success had made the studio comfortable, and comfort made Walt restless in the specific way that people who have always needed a problem to solve become restless when the problems are solved. He had an idea. He had been thinking about it for years, in the way that Walt's ideas gestated, not as a formal proposal, but as an image in his mind that kept returning, kept developing detail, kept asking to be made real. He wanted to build a park, not an amusement park, not in the existing sense of the word, which in the early 1950s conjured images of carnivals. Dirty, chaotic, designed to extract money from people with the minimal investment in their actual experience. Walt had taken his daughters to amusement parks and sat on benches watching them ride while he thought, this could be something. This space between the ride and the world could be designed. The whole thing could be intentional. You could build an environment, not just a collection of attractions. You could make a place that felt like stepping inside the story, instead of being reminded of the distance between you and it. He called the idea Disneyland. When Walt first described the concept to people, the reactions were almost uniformly negative. Roy Disney, who had supported every previous Walt venture, who had checked himself out of a tuberculosis hospital to back the first studio, who had mortgaged himself alongside Walt for Snow White, who had been the financial spine of the entire enterprise, told Walt this was a bad idea, not a risky idea that might pay off. A bad idea. The studio's board of directors agreed with Roy. A theme park was not a business they understood or wanted to be in. The capital requirements were enormous. The operational demands were completely outside the studio's expertise. There was no reliable model for whether the idea would work, because because nothing quite like it had ever been attempted. The banks said no. When Walt went to traditional financial institutions for the funding to build Disneyland, they declined. The project was too speculative. A theme park based on cartoon characters built in a Southern California orange grove. There was no data to support a positive investment thesis. Walt was told by virtually everyone in his professional orbit that this was the idea that would finally be too much, that even Walt Disney, with everything he had survived and built, was not capable of making this work. He found the money elsewhere. He sold his vacation house in Palm Springs. He borrowed against his life insurance policies. He convinced his brother, eventually, that the alternative, watching Walt pursue this without Roy's guidance, was worse than the risk of pursuing it with him, and he made a deal that would, in retrospect, prove to be one of the most significant business arrangements in television history. Walt went to ABC, at the time the third-ranked and financially weakest of the three major television networks, and offered them something unusual. He would produce a weekly television program called Disneyland, which would promote the studio's films and showcase the upcoming theme park. In exchange, ABC would take a minority ownership stake in the park and provide $500,000 in financing. ABC agreed because they needed programming and Walt needed money. The arrangement worked for both parties in ways that neither fully anticipated. The television show was an enormous hit. At a time when television was still establishing its cultural authority, Walt Disney's presence on the small screen was a kind of validation that the medium had been waiting for, and the promotional power of the show for the park project was incalculable. Construction on Disneyland began in 1954 in Anaheim, California, on a site that had been an orange grove. The budget was $17 million. This figure was almost immediately inadequate. The construction was plagued with problems. The contractors Walt had hired missed deadlines and exceeded budgets. The labor to build things that had never been built before. Environments designed to be completely immersive. Spaces that were simultaneously theatrical sets and functional public accommodations turned out to be more complex and expensive than the original estimates had accounted for. Walt was on the construction site daily, making changes, demanding improvements, overriding contractors who told him that what he wanted wasn't possible or wasn't affordable. His specific obsessions, the quality of the experience, the completeness of the illusion, the elimination of anything that reminded the visitor of the outside world, cost money at every turn. Opening day, July 17, 1955, was a catastrophe. The opening was broadcast live on ABC, a decision that turned every problem into a public spectacle. Women's heels sank into the asphalt on Main Street, USA, which had been poured the night before and hadn't set properly. The park was dangerously overcrowded because counterfeit tickets had been widely distributed. Rides broke down. The Mark Twain riverboat nearly capsized when too many guests crowded onto its upper deck. Fountains didn't work. There wasn't enough food. The press coverage was scathing. Critics who had already been skeptical of the entire concept now had specific, documented evidence of failure. The television broadcast, meant to showcase the park's grandeur, had instead broadcast its dysfunction to a national audience. Walt watched it all and said almost nothing publicly. He fixed the problems, not over months, but over weeks. The asphalt was fixed. The crowd management was restructured. The rides were repaired. The food service was expanded. The operational problems that had seemed catastrophic on opening day were resolved, one by one, with the same methodical determination that had characterized every previous comeback. Within 3 months of its disastrous opening, Disneyland had welcomed its 1 millionth guest. Within its first year, the park had proven everyone wrong. The financial analysts who had said the idea was unworkable. The studio board that had refused to back it. The banks that had turned Walt down. The journalists who had documented its opening day failures with such evident satisfaction. They were all wrong. Walt was right. Disneyland was not just a profitable venture. It was a new form of American cultural experience. An entirely new category of entertainment that would reshape the industry for the rest of the century and beyond. It proved that an environment could be designed with the same intentionality as a film, that the principles of narrative and visual coherence that Walt had developed in animation could be applied to physical space, that the aspiration to control every element of an audience's experience was not megalomania, but methodology. Walt Disney was 53 years old when Disneyland opened. He had been bankrupt, had been betrayed, had been struck by his own employees, had been mocked and dismissed, and told repeatedly that his ideas were too expensive and too impractical and too far outside the boundaries of what reasonable people could be expected to believe in. He had been right every time. The cost of being right had been almost everything he had. In the last decade of his life, Walt Disney was not a happy man in the conventional sense. He was successful beyond any reasonable definition of the word. He was famous, respected, powerful. Disneyland was generating revenue that transformed the studio's finances. The television program that bore the park's name reached millions of homes every week. Mickey Mouse was the most recognized face on Earth. And yet, Walt was a man who had spent his entire adult life in motion. Problem to problem, crisis to crisis, idea to idea. And the absence of an existential threat was itself disorienting. The survival instinct that had driven him since Kansas City didn't know what to do with success. It kept looking for the next problem, because that was what it had always done. He found it in Florida, the idea of a second park, something even larger, even more ambitious, even more completely conceived than Disneyland, had been forming in his mind since the Anaheim park opened. Disneyland had taught him things. It had taught him that the concept was right, that people would come, that the experience was transformative in ways that justified the expense. But it had also shown him the limits of what he'd built. Disneyland was surrounded by the world, the commercial development that had grown up around its perimeter, the cheap motels, the fast food restaurants, the souvenir shops that had sprung up to capture the money of visitors who left the park, represented everything Walt had spent his career trying to exclude. He had built an island of intentional design, surrounded by a sea of exactly the kind of environment he was trying to provide an escape from. He wanted land, enough land that the world couldn't get in. He secretly assembled 27,000 acres of Florida swampland over the course of several years, using dummy corporations and legal misdirection to prevent the land prices from rising as sellers recognized who was buying. The secrecy was Walt at his most obsessively controlled. A years-long deception conducted at the highest levels of corporate planning, a scheme that required dozens of people to maintain confidentiality, and that succeeded remarkably until Walt was ready to reveal it. He called the project the Florida Project. Later, it would become Walt Disney World, but Walt Disney never saw it built. He was diagnosed with lung cancer in November 1966. The consequence of the camels he had been smoking for decades, the cigarettes that had been constant companions through every crisis and every overnight session and every 3:30 a.m. delivery route of his childhood imagination. He was 64 years old. He died on December 15, 1966, 10 days after his diagnosis became public. He died in a hospital across the street from the studio he had built, the studio that bore his name, that housed his characters, that employed thousands of people who had devoted their professional lives to realizing his vision. The question of Walt Disney's legacy is not simple. The story of his life is not simple. He was a man of enormous gifts and real limitations, creative instincts that were essentially flawless, and interpersonal instincts that were frequently damaging. He built things that gave joy to hundreds of millions of people, and he built them through methods that caused genuine harm to many of the people closest to him. He was not always kind. He was not always fair. His treatment of his workers, particularly in the years surrounding the strike, was not defensible. His credit claiming sometimes obscured the contributions of the people who actually executed his visions. His control, which had been the source of so many of his greatest achievements, shaded at times into something that looked less like artistic integrity and more like an inability to accept that other people had rights and needs that existed independently of his projects. And yet, the world Walt Disney built exists. It exists in physical form in Anaheim and Orlando and Paris and Tokyo and Shanghai. It exists in the archive of the studio's films. Not just the Disney classics, but the entire lineage of American animation that was shaped by what Walt proved was possible. It exists in the concept of the theme park, which he invented from scratch, which had not existed before him, and which restructured the entertainment industry entirely after him. He proved things that needed proving. He proved that animation could carry adult emotion. He proved that a drawn character could inspire genuine grief. He proved that a family could sit together in a dark room and care about something that didn't exist. He proved that an environment could be designed, that intentionality in the construction of experience was not pretension, but craft, and that audiences, real people, not the imagined audiences of focus groups and market research, would respond to that craft with something that looked a lot like love. He refused to quit. That is the simplest and most accurate summary of Walt Disney's life. He was bankrupt at 21 and started again. He was robbed of his character and invented another one. He was struck by his employees and rebuilt the culture from the wreckage. He was mocked for every major idea he ever had and was right about all of them. The cost of this refusal was enormous and real, and distributed inequitably across the people who loved him and worked for him and built things alongside him. Lillian Disney lived with a man who was always more present to his work than to her. Roy Disney spent decades in the service of his brother's vision, postponing his own retirement, managing crises he hadn't created, cleaning up financial disasters that Walt's obsession had generated. The animators who gave years of their lives to producing the work, who were paid modestly and credited inconsistently and dismissed when they pushed back. They gave something to the Disney canon that is visible in every frame of every film, and that is only sometimes acknowledged. Walt Disney didn't believe in magic. He believed in refusing to quit. The magic was the byproduct. The real substance was the decades of failure, the mornings when the money was gone and the character had been stolen, and the distributor had walked away, and the industry was laughing. The real substance was what happened in those moments. The decision, made over and over again, to start anyway. That decision, repeated across 40 years and more failures than most people survive, produced Mickey Mouse and Snow White and Disneyland, and 100 other things that are now so embedded in American culture that they seem like they were always there. They were not always there. They were built. They were built against resistance, against poverty, against betrayal, against the accumulated judgment of every reasonable person who looked at the plan and said it wouldn't work. Walt Disney was not the man the myth says he was. He was something more complicated and more interesting, and, in the end, more human. A man who was genuinely broken in certain ways, who carried genuine darkness alongside the light, who paid for his vision with things that should not have been asked of him and asked too much of others. But the work endures. The worlds he built endure. The specific quality of joy that he dedicated his life to producing. The thing he first felt as a child in Marceline, watching the horizon, believing that imagination was worth something, endures. He was right about that from the beginning. Everything else was the price of being right.